Welcome. Thank you for joining us for worship at Horizon Unitarian Universalist Church in Carrollton, Texas. Because we're worshiping online, you might be joining us from anywhere. Welcome. We're glad you're here. Horizon is a place for the whole family to gather for worship, lifelong learning, community building, and justice making. We are a welcoming congregation, making sure all our families are welcomed here, including our lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer family. We are also a reproductive justice congregation working with other congregations of diverse religious traditions to speak publicly and politically in support of reproductive freedom and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer equality for all Texans. You can find out more about Horizon on our website, horizonuu.org. And as we move back into gathering in person, if that feels appropriate to you, at 1641 West Hebron Parkway in Carrollton, Texas. I'm the Reverend Naomi King, and I had the privilege and honor to spend part of my ministerial training at Horizon as one of the congregation's many interns. I currently serve a community ministry at large, teaching embodied spiritual practices. I'm from the disabled and the queer communities, and I'm very honored today to return to the pulpit of a beloved community of faith, beloved to me and to those who gather here, and to many who have, through life circumstances, been scattered elsewhere.
Graciousness and wisdom guide our words, deeds, and hearts in this day to nurture loving kindness and justice, to root our lives in reverence and thankfulness, and to live persistently and insistently into choosing greater love, peace, and hope in our world. We light this chalice, sign and symbol of our faith, following graciousness and wisdom wherever love leads, through whatever challenges and delights we meet, in dedication and devotion. Please join me now in saying the words of our affirmation. Love is a doctrine of our church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, and to serve humanity in harmony with the earth. Thus do we covenant together.
Come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again come.
Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again come.
Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again come.
This is our story for all ages. It's a participatory story. And so that means that just like most of the rest of life, it works better if you participate when I give the cue and the opportunity. And so before we get into the story very far, I want you to I'll show you what the cue is. And when I flash this sign, I'll say, what do you want? And you get to say, justice. And I'll say, when do you want it? And you'll get to say, now. So let's practice that. Justice and now. So what do you want? Justice. When do you want it? Now. All right. Thanks for practicing. I hope you'll enjoy participating with me. This story originates from what's called the gospel or the good news according to Luke. Luke is the physician. He's following in after Jesus's immediate disciples. And so this is a story he's telling that he thinks that Jesus has told, and it's become a really beloved and important story through the years, and certainly to me. It's found in chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. Understanding that Luke didn't put chapters in there, these were added later. So somebody said, oh, this makes a chapter, and these are these verses that constitute the story. So once upon a time, there was a judge. And this judge, who was supposed to be judging for fairness and equality and upholding the law and making sure that the community was looking out for the vulnerable and the needy, for people who didn't have enough, and to make sure that there was truth and equity and all these sorts of good things that we actually also affirm and promote as part of our values. There was this judge. And it turned out this judge actually didn't care. This judge didn't care about the rules that the judge was told he had to follow or uphold. These were rules that the people of Israel understood to be from God. And they were rules that were supposed to help make a more just and fair society, a more equitable place. And this judge didn't give a hoot. Couldn't care less, right? Just was a judge, wanted to get through life. We don't know why. That's part of the story. We just don't know why the judge was like that. And once upon a time, this person came to him. And this person was a widow, meaning that her partner had died and she was alone in the world. And also in that time meant that she was at greater risk in society, right? Like things wouldn't necessarily go her way. She would have a harder time finding housing, and she would have a harder time making a living. She would have a harder time finding enough to eat. And so those injustices were already stacked against her in the society. And the appeal to the judge in 3 has something to do with this call to take care of the people who are most vulnerable and the most likely to be hurt by people being unfair. And so she comes up to him and she says, I want justice. And he's thinking, yeah, you and everybody else who comes to see me, hence the judge part. But he says, all right, tell me your story, your case. And then she concludes it with, and I want justice. And the judge is like, oh, get out of here. Nobody needs justice. Go away. I'll worry about this another day. This doesn't need to be answered right now. So the judge goes on to his life. And the widow goes away. And the next time the judge holds court, who shows up? And the judge is looking down from the bench and saying, all right, the widow comes forward and he says, what do you want? And she says, participatory part, justice. And he says, when do you imagine you're going to get justice? And she says, now. And he says, no, not now. And she starts to get, understandably, pretty unhappy with this response. I mean, if somebody says to you, you need something really badly like justice, things are really unfair in your life, and you go and appeal to somebody to help make it more just, and they say, not right now, how do you feel? Not so good, right? But the courtroom gets cleared and she has to go away for the day. She comes back the next day and he says, what do you want? And she says, justice. And he says, no, why would you want that? And when would you want it anyway? And she says, now. And And he says, get out of here. And she says, this isn't right. I'm not happy that you're not listening to my case. You're a judge. You're supposed to listen to my case. You're supposed to help make things more fair in the world. You're supposed to enforce the law. And he says, I'm enforcing the law. Goodbye. Next time he has court, guess who's in the audience? She comes forward when it's time to hear cases. What do you want? And she says, justice. And he says, when do you want justice? And she says, now. And he says, no. And she says, this is really unjust and unfair. And I'm so unhappy with you. I'm going to follow you if you don't give me justice. As you can see, threats have started to happen. And he says, I don't need you following me. And no, we're not going to do anything with this case today. And he goes off, but he's starting to get worried because when he leaves the court, who's behind him? And what's she doing? She's wandering behind him going, I want justice. And she says, I want it now. So what is she saying? What does she want? And when does she want it? And she follows him all the way home. And so his family hears this happening. There's this person standing outside saying, I want justice. I want it now. And his family's like, this is really weird and uncomfortable. And I don't know what to do here. And I'm starting to get a little frightened. And you imagine, from the widow's perspective, she's pretty unhappy. This is the person who's supposed to hear justice, and he's not. And she needs justice right now. She needs relief. But he shuts the door in her face. I don't have to wait for another court date. Weeks go by, another court date happens. And she shows up, and he's like, this is not good. I'm a little bit afraid. What's going to happen now? She followed me home last time. And he's sitting there thinking, I don't know. I'm not real comfortable with this situation. I don't know what I'm going to do. I just don't know. So she comes forward and he says, what do you want? And she says, predictably, justice. And he says, when do you want it? And she says, now. And he says, I got to think about that. And he's sitting there thinking about her case and the justice that she wants. And he thinks about the laws and how they're related to what's fair and appropriate and just, and how they might, in this case of ancient Israel, they're related to God's choices and instructions. And he's thinking, I don't actually care what God thinks about me in this. And I'm not sure that I care what my neighbors think about me in this. But I am thinking that if I don't do something about this situation, I am never going to sleep well again, because this person is going to follow me, constantly saying, I want justice and I want it now. So he says, all right, I'll give you your justice. And he rules in her favor. And the case ends. And the story ends there too. And I invite you to think about that this story, which is often told without the perspective of the judge, how it changes when we get to know what the judge feels. And that in every story, there's a lot of people with different feelings going on. And sometimes when we tell the story, those are missing. So I invite you to consider that as we come into our offering words. Our special offering this week is to support Bon Temps Farms. Bon Temps Farms is cultivating growth, nurturing programs of holistic health, wellness, and response to housing challenges, and growing people's and community resilience in South Dallas. Your generosity today supports redefining Bon Temps into a place of vibrant health and well-being. This directly connects with our commitments as Unitarian Universalist to be allies and partners confronting systemic and historic racism and in truly nurturing the inherent worth and dignity of every person. You can find out more about Bon Ton Farms at BONTON Farms, FARMS.org, bontonfarms.org. And thank you for giving generously as your circumstances allow, to help support this justice making that can happen right now. And we'll hear from the offertory created by Carmen Dubrava. This is our time to share what's in our hearts, our joys and our sorrows. Love is the doctrine, the teaching of this church. And it is with this principle that we are present with one another through our joys, sorrows, and especially in the ways these things tend to arrive all at once in one tangled blessing we call life. And I'll invite you to name out loud your joys, your sorrows. You may choose, if you can, in your space, light a candle with that joy or that sorrow, understanding that we'll experience those resonances. We can help feel you in this space. This is all these vibrations that we connect to. And I'll light this candle here, representing all of our candles. Taking the time to lift up what's in your heart, what's in your spirit, what's in your energy self. What's part of your story? May we also attend to the joys and sorrows of this world, nourishing our awareness of our mutual interdependence with all of creation. As we still face a world threatened by pandemic and inequities, may we hold those still suffering from these with loving kindness and with generosity. May we honor the joys and sorrows that remain unspoken, yet live in the spaciousness of our hearts. May we honor the stories of heartache or hope, beauty and loss, confusion and clarity, the stories of transition, of welcome, of departure, of change. May we find that for all of us in need of forgiveness, may we make amends. May justice be nourished. May forgiveness flower from healing, given and received. May we offer up our heartfelt meditations and prayers for the division among our nations, among our families, and in our being. And may we be restored to a new, just, and blessed wholeness in all our amazing diversity. And for the many blessings of our lives, may our hearts open with gratitude to share our blessings with this world and one another. With these candles, may we feel the ways we are connected to each other and to all beings, knowing that what affects one affects us all. I invite you to take a deep breath in with me, allowing the belly to soften. And then bringing your palms together, maybe the heels of the palms together, the last finger and the thumb touch each other, the other fingers extend. This is a mudra of mudita, joy for others. So inviting to lift up from our hearts, from our minds, from our energies, this joy we might have for others genuinely. And then you might stack the hands one over the other, Hridaya Mudra, over the heart, to make space and to feel alongside all of those who are suffering from loss, and grief, from confusion, from anxiety. Those of us who need more structure or more spaciousness, a welcoming presence, and a lamp to help us home. I invite you to bring your palms together, Anjali Mudra. Now offer your generous wishes to this earth, that which supports us, to one another, those we nourish in community and are nourished by in community, to all upon this earth, in our seas, in our air, everywhere, in need of peace and justice and love and liberation. May we keep breathing and meeting this day and each day as it is in truth and reality. What is taught and sought, what is true and real, wholeheartedly, showing up to do our best, the best way we know, and know that that will also be imperfect. And that too is part of life and being. And our best is good and needed and enough because it is our best. I invite the congregation to add their own prayers, meditations, or offerings here. And we might say, Amen, Amen, blessed be, and wonderment and joy to each and to all.
This reading is by Maya Angelou. She did it during the Clinton inauguration, January 1993. It's called The Rock Cries Out to Us Today. So this is an excerpt from that. Each of you a bordered country, delicate and strangely made proud, yet thrusting perpetually under siege. Your armed struggles for profit have left collars of waste upon my shore, currents of debris upon my breast. Yet today I call you to my riverside, if you will study war no more. Come, clad in peace, and I will sing the songs the Creator gave to me when I and the tree and the stone were one.
Resistance, insistence, persistence. And yet, she persisted. Outrage from the United States Senate at Senator Elizabeth Warren, continuing, despite being gavelled down, to read her truth into the record. To persist. To persist also means to insist, which also means, in many ways, to abide, to live within, to live alongside, to live with. As when we might sing, abide with me, fast falls the eventide, The darkness deepens, Lord, with me abide. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, help of the helpless, oh, abide with me. Insistence, persistence, and resistance. When we know something is wrong, when we need relief, when we are yearning for justice. What do we do with these concepts? One of them can seem fairly clearly rooted in faith if you grew up with a Christian background singing that hymn. And if you heard various interpretations that are common in the Christian tradition around the Gospel of Luke in chapter 18, verses 1 through 8, called the judge and the persistent widow, I call the persistent advocate. And that might be. We have a side called justice and we have a side called injustice. And the world can be divided into the good and the bad. And of course, there would be nobody in between. There would be no people who do imperfect things or who have imperfect reasons. There's this sense of the need for purity in how we act and why we act. And the judge and the widow's story asks us to think about that. In the telling that Jesus gave us, the widow isn't necessarily right. And we are told all these reasons why the judge is morally suspect. And yet he can come around to offering justice. But is it truly just if the way there was harsh? And if the way there did not have intention behind it? In yoga, one of the embodied spiritual practices and set of traditions that I teach from, we talk about sankalpa a lot. Intention is how it's usually translated. But that's not really what sankalpa means, not alone. So sankalpa is interested in measuring impact. What happens when you are with this intention over time? Are you having an effect? Does your resistance, your insistence, your persistence change you, anything around you, this world? Does it lay seeds? Is it the next right thing? One of the questions that Arjuna asks in the Bhagavad Gita is, do I have to really do this hard thing? It's the beginning of the Gita, this song that's sacred. And it begins with a person who is sworn in their very being to protect those in danger, to answer the call, to fight. And yet, who is Arjuna called to fight? His relatives, his kula, the people he trained with, his wisdom tradition. He's fighting with his own wisdom tradition. And he says, this is really hard. Do I have to do it? I'd like to not. Thank you. This seems to not be in keeping with peacefulness. And Krishna answers, yeah, actually you do. This is part of your karma, your yoga, how you find your unity and you pursue the Dharma Chakra, the wheel of justice and liberation. And Arjuna's like, what? Really? Tell me more. How do I make it happen? And then we have this beautiful song, the Bhagavad Gita, that is an invitation to understand why we might have to do really hard things in our lives and how we might go about doing them more skillfully. How do we develop upaya, skillful means? How do we abide or persist with these challenges that are part of our deep, faithful path? Now, the Unitarian Universalists, we've got stuff going on. We have internal conversations happening. We have commitments to anti-racism and to being good allies in solidarity with various communities that we have members from, communities that we don't have members in. We have concerns about immigration justice and justice and well-being for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, non-binary folk. We have concerns for reproductive justice, for reproductive freedom, and for these bodies belonging to our own selves. We have a lot that calls us in practice together. And we arrive to these practices through differing beliefs. So the question becomes not what we believe so much as why and how. Why and how do we practice resistance to when things are wrong? When we have moved aside from these faithful promises we've made? And this is a good question in our communities and among our communities and among our communities that are this larger whole called the world. It isn't something that only belongs in this one narrow space or at an annual meeting or as we come up to an election. How we are together is fundamental. And sometimes that involves resisting how we are being together so that we can abide together, live together, insist together, persist together with marvelous diversity. And that's tough. So there's this wonderful story. I grew up in the time of the first flush of AIDS cases. I came of age during that period as a young queer person. And it was a scary time. And I took great inspiration in my life from ACT UP and from Larry Kramer and from people who were saying, activists, lesbian and gay activists and trans activists who are out there saying, you cannot let our people die. It is wrong to say that, okay, this is mostly gay people and drug addicts and people from Caribbean countries who have brown skin. This is wrong. Do not let us die in that first flush. Later, AIDS would spread into other communities, and we had to learn more intersectional practices. And as members of our communities who were in those communities of these groups, we had to change, right? And over time, today, one of the largest leaders in disability justice are queer, BIPOC, that is Black, Indigenous, people of color, who are femme, who live with disabilities. And they lead in so many ways the larger disability justice movement. The whole statement, nothing without us, comes out of mixed race and Black disability justice activists in South Africa during apartheid, saying to white colleagues, don't plan without us, insisting that in order for us to persist together, we all actually need to come together, that we can't leave those perspectives out. And there's this beautiful story, you know, early on in the AIDS epidemic, Dr. Anthony Fauci and Larry Kramer often were put on nose shows opposite of each other. And there would be times when they would be at each other. It seemed like hammer and tongs, very forceful. And the story is told that after one of these interviews, Dr. Fauci called Mr. Kramer and said, I thought that actually went really well. And Mr. Kramer's like, what are you talking about? We fought. He said, well, you don't understand. I need you to say certain things that I can't say. Larry Kramer died this past year. He outlived what he expected at the beginning of the AIDS crisis, and then passed away in this time of pandemic. He inspired generations of people to go ahead and persist, insist, demand what we need in order to live, to survive. And there are other people who might look like they were on the other side, like at that point, Dr. Fauci. And yet they were working, he was working, and many other of his colleagues were working on trying to find answers and treatments, and also having to deal with the rest of us: bureaucracy, bigotry, distaste, revulsion, what in yoga we might call the kleshas. These senses of how we end up with misinformation, and these things will lead us. The kleshas are causes of suffering, and they include avidya, ignorance, asmita, egoism or I amness, right? Like what I feel is most important, what I need is most important. Raga, attachment, dvesha, repulsion or aversion, and abnivesha, the fear of death and the will to live. That all of these things that bind us are ways that take us away from our abilities to be with one another, to nurture this world. When we insist that we are the only right ones, what do I want? Justice. When do I want it? Now. Not like what's going on. We don't know anything actually about the rest of the people in that court. We don't know if how many weeks this went on in the story that's told. We don't know how the judge's family, if he had a family, felt that this person was persisting and insisting. We don't know a lot. And yet, because the tradition teaches us this is a simple story, we stop looking for answers frequently. It changed my life when I was in 8th grade, and I was asked to read the Bible, but write it out as a series of soap operas. And I'd never written or read a soap opera before or seen one on TV. I actually watched a few episodes to try to figure out what was happening and what the structures were. And then I got it, that this was about the dramatization of life and how we miss each other, how we miss each other with ignorance, avidya, how we miss each other with I amness, this egoism of asmita, how we miss each other with attachments to outcomes and to things and to particular people or to particular ways of being, dvesha, revulsion, repulsion, aversion, real nausea. I can't do that. That's the most disgusting thing ever. And abhinivesha, the fear of death, the will to live. I can't do that. I'll end up alone and nobody will be there when I die. These are hard things. These are very human things. And with that perspective, coming back to the biblical texts, they started to live for me. They started to make sense because I would start asking these questions of like, who's not here? Why does the received tradition tell me this? What is the received tradition not telling me? No, I was taught to have a good suspicion of the people in authority. And I was also taught that when there were problems, they were on me to help solve. And when I came back and be like, oh, this terrible thing happened and this is awful and somebody should do something about it, my whole family turned to me and be like, so what's your plan? Not because I was going to have the total answer, but because I'm already part of this life. And it is on me to be part of the solutions to the things that are problems. It is why I couldn't stay sitting back in various things that happened in my life, whether we're talking about the pandemic, or we're talking about during the AIDS crisis, or we're talking about this push for LGBTQ equality, or we're talking about Black Lives Matter, talking about killing children for having water guns because of the color of their skin, or pulling people over because of the color of their skin, or other forms of enforcement and policing that results in tremendous inequities in health outcomes, in mortality, in childhood mortality, infant mortality, and in the long-term well-being of our societies. It's hard to trust if life hands you in the society a raw deal, a saying that because you were born this way in this particular zip code, you are less likely to have a decent job, a home, an education, or even frankly to live when you go out for a drive. These are things we need to pay attention to, but we won't when we're looking at one story and working from received tradition. Why? Received tradition is usually the tradition of authority. And traditions of authority have an interest in supporting their own selves. And so we need to start to give ourselves some of that own agency and authority to resist complying automatically with that first push of authority in many cases, not all, right? Like if it says, somebody says fire and you need to get out of the building, go. If you're in the tornado zone and you have the tornado alarms go on, better to comply at that moment and then figure it out later. Like if somebody didn't do the right thing and they pulled the alarm. But these other more complicated questions, when we're being fed stories, need thinking. And they need us to talk them out with each other and say, who's not here? Whose perspectives aren't part of this? What are we missing? Why? What does this, who benefits? This great question from Cicero. Who benefits? Where's the money? And who doesn't benefit? When we bring those questions to our lives, we have an opportunity to really notice where injustice happens. And when we inadvertently might participate in aiding and abetting injustice, we might even consciously participate. Although if we do that, most people I know feel like they're doing the right thing. Because we're working from ignorance or egoism or repulsion or attachment or this fear of death, we can't actually perceive the whole thing. So how do we have faith? How do we change that? Love is the spirit of this church. And indeed, it's one of the guiding principles for me in how to abide, how to persist and insist that if I am moving away from love, I have more skills to learn. There are times, as Dr. Fauci pointed out to Larry Kramer back in the beginning of the AIDS crisis, where if ACT UP hadn't been as loud and insistent and angry and dramatic, change wouldn't have happened. That turned out to be part of the skillful means. But it was skillful means working with other people who were doing other things, who might not have looked to the folks in ACT UP as though they were actually doing as much work or the right thing. And so this is a helpful reminder that what the right thing is, depending on our circumstances, might look differently. But it needs to contribute to greater liberation, greater love, greater generosity, greater well-being for everybody and this earth. And that is tall and complicated and challenging. And there are no simple answers. And so we come back to our faith practices, to notice resistance in our bodies, to ask questions about that, to ask questions about resistance in our world and the received wisdom stories that we have, and who benefits from those stories, who's left out. And then to insist on bringing in more complexity, more pieces, greater understanding, greater depth, to find out and be able to be together with each other in the gray zone, not to divide the world into good and bad, but to recognize, this other person with hopes and dreams and problems, and probably also with some aspect of the kleshas in their life, with ignorance, with egoism, with attachment, with repulsion or aversion, with this fear of death and this need to live. Because most of us are dealing with that stuff. And it's okay. It doesn't make us less of a person. It's nothing to have shame over. The issue is what we choose once we recognize that that is true and real. We have choices. We have authority in our lives to make change, to nurture what is healthful and good, to grow more loving and more compassionate and more generous. And know that as we do so, we will change. We will be challenged to change. And the world is also going to change with us. Resistance, insistence, persistence, justice, and abiding with transcendent and immanent love. This is part of our calling as people of faith in this day and this age. And you can absolutely disagree and argue and bring other viewpoints, because that too is what we do and who we are together to find what's true and what's real and what we need to be able to do. I hope you have a beautiful week and that your heart is filled with love and with hope and with a keen understanding that none of us has the whole picture, story, or interpretation. Thanks for joining us here at Horizon. We hope to see you again.
Though this light is extinguished here, It's carried into the world in each of our hearts to bring greater joy, peace, love, justice, wherever we are and wherever we go. Let's say together our mission: to welcome radically, love boldly, grow spiritually, and serve courageously. We carry this commitment in our hearts until we're all together again. We do this because we envision a beloved community helping all to thrive in a just world.
When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, when we trust the wisdom in each of us, every color, every creed and kind, and we see our faces in each other's eyes. When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, when we tell our story from deep inside, and we listen with a loving mind, and we hear our voices in each other's words, then our heart is in a holy place. When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, and we share the silence of sacred space, and the God of our heart stirs within, and we feel the power of each other's faith. When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place.
So I invite you to bring your palms together at your heart center in Anjali Mudra. Then bring your hands to your forehead. May you have peace and power and love in your thoughts, your dreams, and your imagination. Bringing your thumbs to your lips. May you have peace and power and love in your words, your songs, and your silences. And to your heart. May you have peace and power in your heart with a great abiding love, insistent, persistent love, so that wherever you are, whatever you face, you can keep showing up wholeheartedly, doing your best, and trusting that you and your best are needed and good, and together with all of us doing what we can, enough, because it has to be. Thank you for joining me for worship. And thank you for joining the Horizon Unitarian Universalist Church community for worship. We hope to see you here.